Ho-do-do.
From ScienceSortOf.com, you're listening to Science Sort of.
Hello and welcome to Science Sort of, episode 317. I'm your host, Ryan, and joining me to talk about things that are science, things that are sort of science, and things that wish they were science around the theme Wild Hogs Can't Be Broken. It's returning guest Asher Elbein. We're super excited to have him. We're going to be talking about some reporting he's been doing on the feral hog situation, including his appearance on the hit podcast Reply All, and some other work on the invasive burros of Death Valley. So this ended up being quite a long conversation, but I had a lot of fun catching up with Asher, and we ended up talking about a lot of comic books and movie stuff, which I have split into a second episode of this two-part interview. So part one is all just hogs and burros. Get ready to listen to it because I'm going to drop in that audio right now. I am being joined by Asher Wild Hogs Can't Be Broken Elbein, who is here to talk to us about the work he's been doing. We've had Asher on the show before, but for those for whom this is their first exposure to Asher, he is a freelance journalist, fiction writer, and artist based in Austin, Texas, and he writes for all kinds of great outlets, including the failing New York Times, The Bitter Southerner, and Audubon, and other places that we can talk about in the course of the interview. So thanks for joining us, Asher.
Thank you so much for having me.
How you been?
I've been all right. I've had a lot of really cool projects. I've gone minorly viral, which is, in these strange days, a good thing.
Yeah, I guess we should explain my Wild Hogs Can't Be Broken joke as your middle name. You got replied all. Is that
I did? Yeah. So what happened was I wrote this piece for the Texas Observer back in 2017, I think it was, about the feral hog problem that is sweeping the nation, or at least the Texas part of the nation.
Is it going viral?
Well, the hogs are absolutely going viral because there's actually a swine flu that's apparently killing off like a fourth of the population, but that's a different conversation. In America, the feral hogs are pretty well spread throughout the South. They're very common in Texas. They're in basically the entire state. And I wrote this piece about the sort of like big business of hunting feral hogs and how the feral hog problem in Texas got to be as bad as it was. And it was all tied around this attempt by Sid Miller, the agriculture commissioner, who a friend of mine once described as like a Frenchman's idea of what a Texan is. His attempt to put out this poison, which would supposedly like cure the feral hog menace. And this got everybody up in arms because it's a pretty nasty poison. People were really worried about it harming livestock, like getting into the water, just causing like a huge mess.
Well, because feral hogs are not small animals, so if you put out enough poison to kill one of them.
Yeah.
And if they're the largest land animal around, then you put out enough poison to kill anything.
Yeah. I mean, other than cattle, yeah. And so there were, hunters were really unhappy about it because a lot of hunters are shooting the pigs and then eat, it's pig meat. Like people like to eat that sort of thing, I'm told, as a Jew. There were, environmental people were really upset. Like basically the only people who were happy about it were farmers, and the farmers weren't super thrilled about it either. So this whole thing happened in 2017. The poison never really did get authorized. And I wrote this piece and then kind of like got on with my life. It didn't really seem like that many people had read it. And then fast forward to a few months ago, and I get this email from PJ Vogt of the, well-regarded podcast Reply All saying, hey, I read your piece and we want to do something about the 30 to 50 feral hogs meme. Do you want to come in and talk about it? Which
was like a weird gun control thing where it was after one of the shootings. You go ahead.
Yeah. So what happened was that there was the shooting in El Paso, and as with after every mass shooting, people were kind of like falling into the same sort of tired round of arguments. And I remember...
Are you suggesting that Twitter is not a productive way to steer the political discussion in this country?
Its productivity can be judged for your listeners can judge the productivity for themselves, because in amongst all of the bickering and the sort of like deep, just bone deep desperation and madness, one man responded to musician Jason Isabel's Twitter comment about the need for gun control with the age-old question, well, what then am I supposed to do about the 30 to 50 feral hogs that come into my yard within 3 to 5 minutes of my children playing? And everybody saw this and lost their minds. Like,
I saw it and I assumed he was trolling. Like, I assumed it was a completely made-up scenario.
It seemed like a joke, and it was like, and so I saw this, and having written about feral hogs, I still was like, okay, that 30 to 50 is unlikely. But like, and it was just like, it was fun to make jokes about it. And I made a lot of jokes about it, and everyone made a lot of jokes about it. It was a very good day on twitter.com, mostly because I think we were all having the equivalent of a nervous breakdown or a drowning man clutching to like a piece of driftwood. But it basically just the term 30 to 50 feral hogs became this meme that is still getting thrown around, and feral hogs sort of have become a little bit of a stock comedy trope. And I think that's how the Reply All guys like got into it. They were like, oh, there seems to be this like internet meme going on. And, internet memes are what we do. Yeah,
for people who don't listen to Reply All, it is a very good show. It's more popular than ours, so I won't recommend you listen to it. Just listen to our back catalog. But
yeah, they don't need the royalties.
It is a show that is functionally on its surface about the internet, but because the internet is everything these days, it tends to go to some pretty wild places in their pursuits. So, and
one of the places it went was feral hogs, because PJ Vogt, who's one of the hosts, seems like he just started looking at it. And as happens with a lot of people who are not from the South or sort of like rural, when they hear about feral hogs, they get really fascinated because it's often the first time that they've heard about the sort of sheer intractability of this problem in America, that there are these massive amounts of extremely clever, extremely adaptable, extremely fast breeding animals, which are very well established and not going anywhere, no matter how much people shoot them.
I would like to take one step back, because this is a question my wife had, and it's actually a pretty good question, because, the America we've lived in, there's a huge domestic pig infrastructure, farming, raising, ranching, herding enterprise, but I don't know the correct term for raising pigs. And then there are hog-like animals that are endemic to the Americas in the family Tesuidae, and then there are these feral hogs. So can we define some terms to make sure that everybody actually knows what animal we're talking about as we discuss this issue?
Yeah, certainly. So as you say, there are captive pigs, which are bred for meat production, are thoroughly domesticated, although they will still probably eat you if you fall into their pen.
And domestic pigs, that's a Eurasian breed.
Well, yeah, that's let's just say an old world pig.
Okay.
And then in America, we have, in the United States, there are javelinas, which are not technically pigs as we think of them. They're related, but they're not the same animal.
Wait, so that I'm actually not familiar with that word. Is that what you would call a peccary?
Yeah, peccary. So javelina is the sort of Texans like Southwest regional name for it.
Gotcha. That's you saying coyote instead of coyote.
Yeah, exactly. So and I forget if javelina is originally Spanish or if it is also like a Nahuatl loan word like coyote. But
interesting. Okay.
In any case, yeah. And then you have the feral hogs, which are the descendants of domestic pigs that have sort of like bred out and lost a lot of their sort of domestic traits and live as functionally wild animals. Although they come from this sort of like old world stock, and their genetics probably are traceable to specific breeds. They basically reverted to looking very much like wild boars, even though they are not specifically related to like the Eurasian wild boar.
So as my wife and I were discussing this before I got on the Skype call with you, I was looking up the etymology of all the different words we have for pig. So I went ahead and looked up javelina for you. Andalusian Arabic.
Really?
Yeah.
That's fast.
Yeah, mountain pig, jabali.
Wow. Okay, that you learn something new every day.
Yeah, I thought that was pretty cool. So yeah, part of the Iberian integration with the Arabic world, which is pretty neat. And then I was looking it up. So we have a couple different words for pig that we use in English. One of which is pig, which comes from Old English.
Right.
Hog comes from, it's a Celtically derived word. And then
that makes sense.
Yeah, and then boar comes from Old German. And so originally boar meant an uncastrated male pig. Pig was the general term. Hog was also a general term. So that's sort of where it's because English has so many different languages converging on it. I actually didn't look up. So the scientific name for these wild hogs is still Sus scrofa, which is the same species as a domestic pig.
Right, because they are technically the same species, given that species is a completely notional concept and doesn't really exist.
Right. But that is also the idea of a suid is that it kind of hinted at in that generic term for Sus.
Right.
That comes from the Latin. So we've got like 4 different languages all kind of converging in our English idea of what makes up a pig. So I just thought that was cool, and I just wanted to clarify to make sure we all knew what animals we're actually talking about.
And very interestingly, the term for an animal in America that is not a pig but is pig-like is itself brought over by, as you say, like, the Spanish conquistadors, and it's a loan word from Arabic.
Right.
Linguistics, it's wild.
It's fun though. I don't know. You and I are guys. We deal with words a lot in our jobs and our daily lives, and I always like looking into where things come from.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I think is really particularly interesting about the feral hog problem is there's a sort of like conceptual issue. Well, okay, so there are 2 conceptual issues. The first one is this question of like, what do you do with invasive species when it's clear you're never going to get rid of them? Like, when do you say, okay, this thing is no longer an alien, it's a part of the landscape, it's just a part of the landscape that we don't like and that we need to manage? And the other sort of conceptual problem is thinking about the way that feral hogs got established in the first place was, when Hernan de Soto showed up in the Southeast on his sort of like what he would have called a mission of conquest, and what the rest of us with the benefit of hindsight can call essentially like in exercise and banditry. Like, if you show up with a bunch of armed men and steal a bunch of gold and then like hightail it out of there, you're a bandit. But he brought along a bunch of pigs, and the pigs were there to provide this sort of mobile larder, and a bunch of them ended up getting left behind. So there have been pigs in the feral pigs in the Americas for quite a while, but they didn't really get established until people started stocking them in Louisiana and Texas for hunting purposes in the like 60s, 70s, and 80s, because they're apparently really fun to hunt. So run into
the 60s,
this
70s, and 80s of the 1900s?
Yes.
Okay.
So there's this sort of thing that happens where people look at the pigs as if they're alien. They talk about that. They sometimes sort of talk about them as being introduced by humans, but there is a sense of them being this alien menace that is overtaking perfectly healthy ecosystems that cannot possibly hope to stand against, these pigs. But in actual fact, we know that there have been pigs in America at least since De Soto, and they didn't explode in numbers populations. Like, for whatever reason, they were kind of around, but they weren't, this sort of like all-consuming, ravening horde. So what changed, and what I think is probably one of the things that changed, is that the destruction of a lot of native habitat or even the disruption of a lot of native habitat and the eradication of a lot of predators created this sort of like perfect virgin field for them, which may not have been the case even if they had been introduced, earlier in America. And then when you combine that with people stalking them for hunting, you get this sort of like perfect storm where suddenly this, again, incredibly adaptable, incredibly intelligent, incredibly like versatile animal can just kind of go, if you will, hog wild.
So Hernando de Soto, you said hog wild. There's an etymology joke in there somewhere. Also use the word larder, and I feel like there's an obvious connection between like lard being a pig-derived cooking fat.
Sure. Yeah.
And the word larder as a place to store your food, probably pig food either from pigs or you would feed to pigs. Yeah, it's interesting the idea that the predators being gone So it's like Hernando de Soto could have caused the same problem, except there were still like wolves and mountain lions running around to take these things out. That's cool. I hadn't thought about that aspect of it.
Well, and this sort of is a good jumping off point too, if you're okay with a bit of a segue.
Absolutely. Wouldn't be an episode of Science Sort of if we didn't also take a moment to talk about what we are drinking. Friends, I'm feeling a little bit under the weather. When I'm under the weather, it's not a great time to have a bunch of alcohol. So instead, I'm having a tea, and I picked up a local tea from Running Byrd Tea Company here in Washington, D.C., and this is their spiced Thai Running Byrd tea from Washington, D.C. It's kind of like if Thai tea was iced tea, but without sort of the cream. And, again, when you're not feeling great, you don't want maybe as much dairy as well. So this is a delight. I really enjoy it. I enjoy all their stuff from their company. There's a free ad. They did not pay for this ad, but what the hey? It's good tea, everybody. Check it out. I think they have it at the pizzeria locations around town as well for your fast casual pizza needs. And if you want some tea. All right, free ad over. Let's get back to talking with Asher.
This other story that I just recently did for Undark magazine, which is an online magazine that is science journalism, but with more emphasis on journalism about science as opposed to what science journalism can sometimes be, which is sort of glorified press releases. And I'm casting no shade on anyone here. It's just like there's a sort of like a way that science journalism in newspapers is often presented as here's what the scientists say, and not actually like deep reported sort of like in some ways like investigative pieces into science itself.
This really is an interesting finding, said Dr. So-and-so who was not involved with the study.
Yeah, that versus
I don't need every freaking article has like a pull quote from scientists who wasn't involved with the study where they just comment on this was a cool study. I'm like, thanks. That's helpful. Yeah. Which I get it. That's the format.
It's the thing that we have to do. But
right. I'm not saying it's unnecessary. I personally, as a sometimes working scientist, find it tedious. That's all.
And frankly, as a working science journalist, I find it somewhat tedious, not because I don't like talking to people who aren't involved who can like give me perspective, but because there's something about this sort of like when you have to check a box, you can tell when somebody's having to check a box.
Yes, I think that's a great way of putting it.
So the thing about Undark, so I wrote this piece for Undark, which is about the feral burrows of Death Valley, which is another case where you have these large adaptable mammals.
You have these large tunnels. Is that...
the burrows I was choosing not to acknowledge that.
Now when they're small, when it's a little burrow, that's actually a tortilla with meat and other fillings.
Yeah, burrito. Yeah, sure.
Popularized in the Mission District of San Francisco.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, so there are wild donkeys living in Death Valley, the Spanish name burro, which I don't know what the etymology of that is, but they were brought in somewhat similarly, like very early on to help work mines and kind of like various sort of like, so, just like it's good to have an animal that can live out there in the desert Southwest.
So it's a hardy animal.
It's a very hardy animal. It's a hardy animal that can live in a very hard ecosystem. So when in the 1800s, a bunch of those mines closed, the miners didn't really know what else to do with the burrows. So they just set them loose. And the burrows, being animals that are descended from scrubland and desert wild sort of equids, got along perfectly well in that ecosystem. And as the sort of like desert Southwest has been irrigated and sort of like preserved and set aside in various preserves, the burrow populations have skyrocketed. So the connection to what we were talking about with the feral hogs and the predators is that in much of the rangeland of the desert Southwest and the West, mountain lions and wolves have been managed, but often like pretty extensively culled. So now there's this problem where there are, according to the people in the Park Service, there are too many burrows, and they cause all of these impacts on native wildlife and native vegetation. They compete with, they're competing with animals like the bighorn sheep, which are, again, native and people are trying to reintroduce. But it's complex. So there's this research by this guy, Eric Lundgren, who does a lot of work on sort of novel ecosystems, which is to say ecosystems that are inflected or influenced or in some way like wholesale, like completely changed by human interference or the introduction of exotic species. And so he started doing all this research on burrows in Death Valley. And what he was starting to find was that burros, one of the things that they do is that they dig wells, which get used as sort of like germination nurseries by native plants and as water resources by native species.
They don't dig burrows.
No, a burro would have to dig a very large burrow to get out of the sun, but they do dig a lot.
So there's that English phrase, "You wouldn't know your ass from a donkey," right?
Yeah.
Or no, it's you wouldn't know your ass from a hole in the ground, right? That's the phrase.
Yeah. It is.
It works a little bit if you mix it with the Spanish, because you could also say you wouldn't know your burro from a burro.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's good.
Have you never heard that? Am I introducing you to this joke?
No, I'd heard it. I just never made the connection. And the thing that's interesting is that there were a lot of the early research on wild donkeys in Death Valley would note the well digging behavior, but would just note it as the burrows, as the burros like just digging, and did not really ascribe these values to it. And the thing is, there are probably too many wild donkeys in Death Valley just because there aren't a lot of things that eat them. But one of the things that Lundgren is finding is that there are mountain lions in the like protected parts of the park that are starting to kill and eat burros. And presumably, like in all these different parts of like the West where this is a problem, where there are too many burros, this issue could potentially be dealt with instead of having to do these massive culls of burros by, letting the mountain lions do the thing that mountain lions do and treating these animals as like a part of the ecosystem now instead of this alien element that needs to be expunged, because you're never going to get rid of them. They're thoroughly woven in. And so at some point you just need to say like, okay, this is the ecosystem that we have. Maybe if we're managing for, let's say, ancestrally native wildlife, you can do that, certainly, but you need to be like honest about what you're doing. You're not necessarily preserving the integrity of the ecosystem just because there are new animals on it. If they're doing things that are used by other animals and if other animals in the ecosystem are eating them. There's this idea that nature in America started with when like Europeans got here.
False.
But of course, yeah,
when the last glacier melted.
Yeah, there have been.
That is as a person who studies, Pleistocene megafauna, that is kind of my perspective, actually.
Well, okay, but as a person who studies Pleistocene megafauna, one of the things that we know is that there were, until very recently, geologically speaking, horses all over America of one kind or another, wild horses, and so this thing of like, oh, well, these burros don't belong here, these wild, or like the Mustangs don't belong here. It's like, well, what belongs here? What does belonging even mean? Like, these are landscapes that, again, very recently had a lot of wild equids that may or may not have been doing the sorts of things that burros were doing, but were presumably doing equid things. And so those landscapes were also a lot healthier because they had a lot of, sort of like wild living predators, and they had, these full biodiverse ecosystems that weren't sort of like creaky and rotten from human development and sort of industrialization. But there's this real, I think, height of arrogance to say, okay, well, we know what this ecosystem needs, and what it needs is us shooting mountain lions and wild burros to protect bighorn sheep. Like, by all means, protect the bighorn sheep, but at some point you have to look at the ecosystem and say, is the ecosystem functioning regardless of whether or not it looks like the thing that we think it should look like?
So I have 2 points to build off of that, because I think that what you said is really interesting. I had a conversation with someone who studies carbon sequestration in rangeland ecosystems.
Mm-hmm.
This was not on the show. This was a conversation in real life, so the people listening don't... Unlike many times when I refer to conversations, this isn't something they've heard. And one of the points that they were making...
You should get them on the show.
I've thought about it. They might be limited in what they're able to say because they work for the federal government. So that's my caveat. They might not be able to tell us what they really think unless we did like some weird voice modulation. Maybe it's you. Maybe I tricked, no. Could be. So
Who are any of us, really?
Right. We're not ready to talk about Watchmen yet. I'm not there. So their point they were making, which was fascinating, I really enjoyed the talk that they gave, was about how like carbon sequestration in rangeland ecosystems is actually a pretty long-term place to store your carbon, but it's one that's pretty fragile. It doesn't take much to accidentally disrupt it and then release the carbon. And part of that story is the feral horse issue. Feral horses, I imagine burros as well, can disrupt that by digging things up or pulling up grass, and eating it from the root down and all that sort of stuff. So when I asked them about the feral horse issue, their response, as somebody who's studying carbon sequestration, which is like a millennia scale issue, said that, well, feral horses have been evolving in the ecosystem for 10,000 years. And I'm thinking as a paleontologist, like, that's not that much time, really. A lot's changed, obviously, and the way we live on the environment has changed drastically, but it doesn't feel like, kind of like you were saying, it doesn't feel like as long time scale of an issue as we sometimes, as humans, want to make it out to be.
Right.
And then there is always that issue of just like, well, so many of these problems would be naturally, for however loaded that term is, mitigated by just having an appropriate predator-prey ratio in the environment.
Yeah, one of the things that is, I was talking to, oh gosh, I forget who it was. I'm not trying to protect anyone's identity. I just genuinely don't remember. But I was talking to one researcher who made the point that often when we talk about invasives, what we're really saying is very successful exotic species whose presence we find upsetting. Possibly, like, and for legitimate reasons often. Like, I'm not out here saying like actually the feral hogs are good, but there you get to this point where it's like one of the reasons that invasives do well is a lot of these are animals that do extremely well in disrupted ecosystems. And so if you have an ecosystem that is, again, this is a sort of a loaded word, healthy, or at the very least is not disrupted for whatever that means, exotics don't tend to get an easy foothold there, or they get a foothold and there's a period of 5 or 10 years where they go a little crazy and then things kind of like work themselves out. So an example of that, one of the pieces that I'm working on now is all about sort of wild game ranches in Texas and these various Indian and African species that have been introduced onto shooting ranches in Texas, many of which have gotten out and are now, sort of trying to figure out what their place in the ecosystem is. So there are these animals called nilgai, which are the largest Indian antelope and the second largest antelope in the world. They're just these sort of immense shouldered, like really powerful horse-sized, like 500-pound antelope. And they are all throughout the southern borderland.
This is the article you wrote for the Texas Observer?
No, this is an article I'm working on now for
Okay.
Texas Highway.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so these antelope are all throughout the borderland, but they can't. They're range limited in how far north they can spread on account of they can't really handle the cold. And as for the rest, it's, there's not really anything here that can eat them. But also they have very specific water needs, which are being subsidized by all of the cattle wells out in, these big ranches where they're living wild on the ranches. But, if the land wasn't under human cultivation, they could not survive there. So does that mean that, they're unnatural, but the cattle wells are unnatural. And the cattle wells also, they don't just water the cattle, which are themselves like the most successful exotic animal in the Americas.
Maybe the world?
Probably the world, yeah. But the cattle wells also subsidize a tremendous amount of native wildlife that otherwise it was quite rare in that region when there just wasn't a lot of surface water to be had. So you run into these sort of like, what is not even just like what is native, but like what belongs. But when I was talking to people about nilgai, one of the things they were telling me is, well, they compete with the white-tailed deer and the cattle. I was like, okay, the white-tailed deer are native. I can see why that is a concern, if that's a concern. But the cattle aren't native. But cattle are acceptable. Cattle are the thing. We think of cattle as like a normal thing to have on the landscape in Texas. And I'm not even saying that they're not. The whole thing is, I think, much more complex.
Well, but it's an assumption.
It is an assumption. And there are all these assumptions that get made about invasive species, which I don't know how much of it has been really thoroughly, deeply looked at beyond sort of extrapolation from things that have happened on islands or some things that have happened in Australia. And like...
Which I'll clarify your point slightly, because...
Please.
So much of like this sort of big picture ecosystem biology is based off of what we observe on islands, because islands represent an easier place to test these ideas or observe our theories for what may happen than continent scale ecosystems. So like, it's an open question, how much can we apply what we see on islands to what's happening on a continent?
Yeah, and again, I want to be very clear that I am not saying that there are not negative impacts from exotic animals, whether those are exotic insects all the way up to like big exotic Indian antelope, that there aren't negative impacts on the ecosystem from those animals getting established. But the sort of prevailing orthodoxy is that any impact that you see of any kind is, I forget the Latin, but is a priori like a bad influence.
It's Latin that you claimed you forgot. You mean from first principles?
Yeah. Yeah. Like there's this idea that if you see an impact, all impact is bad.
But it's all impact is bad if the root cause of it at some fundamental level is human.
Right. And there's, I think, a really weird sort of like displaced guilt that gets projected out onto a lot of these species. And I think, honestly, a lot of that rhetorical guilt, it's not very helpful. And I think it may actually blind us to seeing some of the really interesting things that are happening in some of these novel ecosystems. And more to the point, it's very bad science to have this sort of like ideological perspective on what's happening without a lot of like pretty careful research. Like one of the reasons I'm doing this work on game ranches in Texas is that I had the realization that there are these massive stretches of rangeland in Texas that have free range exotic animals on them. And I went looking around to see if anyone had studied that, like really studied it. Like, what are these animals doing on the landscape? They're on the landscape. They're technically behind fences, but like so are the cattle, and like the cattle are doing things. What are these animals doing? Nobody seems to know. Nobody seems to have listened to it.
So it's interesting that you talk about it being bad science, because maybe it's an argument to be made whether or not this counts as conservation biology. But one of the things I learned when I was taking biology courses in college was that conservation biology is fundamentally a crisis discipline.
Yeah.
The world's on fire. How about yours? That's Smash Mouth. But you have to just deal with the situation as it is as quickly as possible. And it doesn't always, like science, the way that other types of science are fundamentally built is about caution and care and being careful and being considerate because you've got time. But with conservation biology, we don't have time. Like we gotta figure this out. We gotta manage the situation. It also comes down to management decisions.
Right.
And management decisions aren't always made on the basis of what's the best science saying, because you have to consider other considerations besides just the data. There's also just like, how do people feel?
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. And what I would add to that is that the problem is that you end up with, okay, so here's an example of a place where those kinds of management decisions that are coming from a place of sort of like crisis thinking, which is not like, you will never hear me say like, oh, crisis thinking is overblown, because we are actually in a truly horrific biodiversity crisis.
Oh yeah, I wasn't arguing that crisis thinking is a bad way to consider things, but it at a certain point, like, it's about balancing. You're putting your house on fire while also thinking about, what are the properties of the wood of my house that made it more likely to burn?
So per that, one of the interesting things I learned in the course of reporting this article about wild burros in Death Valley is that there are these sort of fragile wetland environments in and around like the vicinity of Death Valley that host these fairly endangered species of endemic fish. And one of the things that they found that the burros were doing was the burros were going in and like wading into the wetlands and eating all the reeds. And that, people were just like, okay, well, clearly we need to clear out the burros. They stop like eating the native vegetation. And so they go in, they go through and do this huge removal process with the burros. And so the burros are no longer eating the weeds. Well, what turns out to happen is that with nothing eating the weeds, grow in and sort of like encircle these very fragile wetlands and silt them out and suck the water out. And so now there are people whose job it is to go in and clear out these, clear the weeds back to keep open water and keep open water habitat for the fish, which require it, and the other animals which make use of it. So you have this thing where, okay, the burros are not native and they're eating the weeds and they're causing impact. And it seems like nobody ever stopped to ask the question of, like, what if this impact is actually not a negative impact? And that's where you start ending up with this problem of, managing ecosystems is really hard, and and nobody quite knows what anything you do is going to result in, which is not a reason not to manage. It just means that a little bit of humility and a little bit of sort of willingness to accept that maybe what the sort of prevailing paradigm says might not be the best way to handle things. That
put another way, if you're talking about managing an entire ecosystem, the phrase, well, this is how we've done it before, so this is the way we should do it next time, is never an acceptable justification.
Yeah, precisely. And I think that there is a certain blindness that is very easy to fall into, which is, well, we know how this stuff works. Invasives are bad. Yeah, sometimes they are. Or at the very least, sometimes invasives or exotics have impacts that we don't like, and we have to manage to make sure that those impacts don't affect the ecosystems in a way that we don't care for. But we've got to be very straight up about what it is that we're managing for. And it would help if I think there was some clarity about, are you managing to have an ecosystem that's 100%, Native American animals, or are you managing to have an ecosystem where the springs stay open and the pupfish are alive? Because it might be that you can't have both, and you might have to make a decision.
Okay, so I've been desperate to ask you this question since we started talking about this topic, and it's that in thinking about these issues and reporting on these issues of invasives, but invasives that have been here for a long time, and like the role of ecosystem services and things like that, have you thought about this all as it applies to the ideas of rewilding?
Yes, I have. There was a piece I wanted to do. I never did find a buyer for it, which, fingers crossed, maybe it'll come back around one day. But there's an elephant sanctuary in South Georgia that I was desperate to do a story on, because I was thinking there haven't been elephants on the landscape in South Georgia since the period of time that you study. And elephants are animals that, they knock over trees, like they dig wells, like they do all kinds of things. They
ecosystem engineers.
Yeah, they're ecosystem engineers. So I think the thing that's really interesting about rewilding is that...
Which we should define very quickly.
Yes, please do.
It's just the idea that there was an ecosystem that existed in North America in particular, because that's where a lot of the academic thought has been put forward on this issue, that is gone since the end of the last ice age, which was sort of my joke of like, I think about the ecosystem as a thing that existed since the last glacier melted. But there are people who advocate, a small but vocal group of people that advocate that we should put these animals back on the ecosystem. And when I say these animals, I mean like, because we don't have mammoths anymore, let's put elephants in the environment. Because we don't have the American cheetah anymore, let's put African cheetahs. Because we don't have American lions, let's put African lions. Are you seeing a trend? We're going to go to Africa, we're going to take living beings and bring them to America and make them do what we want. It's not a great look.
No.
I'm just going to throw that out there.
No, it's certainly not.
It's got some historical precedent that's problematic, but there are still people...
Also,
yeah, go ahead.
The thing that you end up with, too, is that the animals in Africa are not a perfect analog for what was here.
And the term I've heard for that is Frankenstein ecosystem, and I love that term.
I don't even know if I would go that far. I mean, I think novel ecosystem is... I still like novel ecosystem as a less...
You were my introduction to that term.
Novel?
Yeah, not the term novel, but the term novel ecosystem. I remember reading, when I was doing my initial research, this is probably 5-6 years ago, on the whole idea of rewilding and some of the problems that come associated with it. There was a comment written to one of the articles that I'd read, and this is all in the scientific literature, that was making the argument that, like, if you just take things that you think, using the Frankenstein analogy and probably ruining it for over-explaining it, but, like, if the American cheetah was your right arm, and now all those cheetahs are gone, and you take African cheetahs and you stitch it onto that ecosystem, you've stitched on a thing that looks functionally like a right arm, but it may not actually work that way. So I thought that was an evocative term. I think novel ecosystem, I agree, eliminates some of the baggage there, and really it should be Frankenstein's monsters ecosystems, I think.
So, well, yeah, I mean, as long as we're being pedantic about it, yes, certainly.
I've given up on being pedantic about that particular Frankenstein monster versus Frankenstein thing. My favorite, I don't know, did you see the tweet? It was going around for a while where somebody had taken a book of Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus, whatever the actual title of the novel is.
Yeah.
By Mary Shelley. And on the last page, when the monster is literally out on an ice floe, floating out to sea, never to be seen or heard from again, they wrote in pencil underneath the last line of like, oh, and by the way, I don't mind if you just call me Frankenstein instead of Frankenstein's monster.
Yeah, really I saw that.
Okay. It's really not a big deal.
Yeah, but to the point about novel ecosystems or Frankenstein's ecosystems, the thing that is so fascinating to me about this question is that what you absolutely cannot do is you can't, for example, put elephants in Montana. They will die. They're not adapted for that ecosystem. They are not adapted.
Montana has winter.
Yeah, Montana has winter. Like the elephants that are currently alive are not mammoths and they're not mastodons.
That's why you never hear elephants saying, well, I just want to live in a place that has seasons.
Yeah. I mean, elephants are Floridians at heart.
Yeah, that's why they're all wrinkled and look like retirees.
yeah, just enormous altacockers, a lot of them.
I was born in Florida. I can make that joke.
I was not, and you don't at me.
At me instead. Tell me your Florida thoughts.
But I think that it is true that, so for example, there is rewilding you can do, which is putting bison back on the landscape. We know that bison, I'm not going to use the term belong because I think that's also a very loaded term.
Interesting. I like that. Okay.
But we know that bison have this long coevolution with the American West. And Ed Yong had a really good recent piece about this, about the way that bison herds kind of like influence and magnify spring growth through their grazing and like nutrient sort of like moving nutrients through the ecosystem. So it is, I think it's absolutely a good idea to try and like restock and rewild with native species. And what I guess I'm advocating for, in as much as I'm advocating for anything, is not so much let's just put a bunch of like weird ass animals from all over the world into America and see what happens. Although there is a part of me that's like, I mean, why not? Might be fun.
Like,
but
we've done enough. Like, why not go?
Like at this point, you might as well.
Hey Asher.
Mm-hmm.
Why not go? Why not go whole hog?
Yeah.
All right, I'll see you later. I'm gonna hang up. Bye.
Yeah, but
end of conversation. We've come full circle. We've come full hog.
Yeah. You leave while you're high on the hog, but
get off your high hog.
Cripes. Yeah, I guess though, I think it is worth thinking about. You cannot recreate extinct ecosystems, but that does not mean that novel ecosystems don't have value of their own, or could not have genuine value if they are allowed to sort of work themselves out into something new. If you have like a lot of burros and a lot of feral pigs, maybe give the mountain lions a sort of a break and let them acquire the sort of hunting culture to start specializing in those animals. And you might start seeing something that starts rebalancing out. But I mean, as long as our management goals are this sort of like twin, protect all native species, but also cows, you're going to see these sort of like weird management conundrums, and you're going to continue having a lot of space for invasive species to spread with only humans hunting them. And it turns out, weirdly enough, humans are not good at hunting down invasive species in America. You'd think they would be. You'd think that it'd be easy to just, megafaunal extinction our way out of this problem, but clearly that has not worked.
Well, I think, you could make the point that humans aren't great at hunting down invasive species in general, because you mentioned Australia, but then we got off topic, but like, just look at Australia. Yeah. And then you think about like not just things like feral hogs. Like feral hogs are big and easy to shoot, but things like red fox, like that's technically an invasive species. We don't think of it that way, but it is. Bullfrogs in Australia, rabbits in Australia. You brought up so many amazing points. It's hard for me to even focus in on one to talk about next. But I think the thing that I want to say is maybe, and this might be the crux. And if you agree that I've found something close to the crux, maybe we can move on from here. But the crux seems to be that when considering your conservation goals, maybe don't just consider what that animal represents, but the ecosystem service it provides.
Yes, I think that is precisely correct.
And so if like you're arguing whether or not we should shoot fewer wolves and mountain lions, if the ecosystem service they're providing is reducing the number of ungulates that can destroy a car with one hit, maybe that's worth the occasional lost cow on a ranch.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to leave it, because I very much agree. I want to see more research on this.
Me too.
Not least because I think it'll lead to better management, but also because we are running one of many unnatural experiments, if you will. But this whole thing is like a massive experiment. And unlike most naturally, of our massive like ecosystem experiments, this one I think actually is not completely depressing, and really has the potential to kind of tell us a lot about how ecosystems change and evolve and sort of reshape themselves in ways that aren't just, oh, hey, there used to be a forest there. Now there's a parking lot. That kind of sucks.
And now Houston is underwater. What are the chances?
And now Houston is underwater. Yeah.
that was part one of my conversation with Asher, but we kept talking for a little while longer about some other stuff that I am dropping into a second episode, and that's going to be available in the feed very, very soon after this episode. Since we recorded them all together, I'm going to try to release them as close together as I can. Since it's just me this time, it's going to be a bit of a truncated feedback segment. But before we dive into one piece of feedback, I want to point out that former guest of the show, Kristina Gaddy's book, Flowers in the Gutter, is now available. So if you would like a book about teenagers fighting Nazis or resisting Nazis, I guess resistance is a type of fighting, get it. It's good, probably. I haven't read it yet, but I would like to. I'm looking forward to it. And she's going to be doing a little bit of a book tour. You can find updates on the book website, flowersinthegutter.com, and we'll link to that in the show notes for this episode. So I haven't featured an iTunes review in a while because I got to admit that the iTunes reviews were kind of bumming me out for a little bit. I wasn't feeling great about that ecosystem as a place for getting feedback about the show that made me enjoy doing the show. But I recently signed up to a service that sends me a weekly email about whether or not there have been any new reviews, and a couple of new ones have come in, and they've been really good, and they've made me feel good again. So I want to feature two of them, one in this episode, one in the next episode. This episode's review comes from isisddog. I think I'm saying that right. If you hear whining in the background, it's because squirrels exist and they can be seen through windows by dogs. But that's not what the review says. The review says, science sorta rocks. 5 stars. This podcast is absolutely brilliant. I love their banter, interviews, and unique subject matters. I hope to be able to become a patron someday, as I love listening and love the availability of most of the archive for free and want to ensure others can have the same opportunity to give a listen. Oh, and I also love beer. Regards, Bros. So that was Bros' review. Thanks so much for leaving that review. It helps a lot, both my self-esteem and the people's ability to find the show when they go check us out in the iTunes stores. And I really appreciate the comment about hopefully becoming a Patreon someday. Patreon is the main way that we financially support the show at this point. So patreon.com/sciencesortof. If you're interested in becoming a patron at any level, you can even put in a custom level. It doesn't have to be one of the prescribed levels that we've put on there. With that, that's going to wrap up the show for this episode. But I've got an entire episode's worth more of discussion with Asher coming up very soon in your feed. Check it. I would say if you're done listening to this episode, hopefully that episode is already up. So go look for it right now. And I'll see you next time, and come back next time, which is still sort of this time, and you're going to get a whole lot more science. And then, Asher, you go ahead and say sort of.
Sort of.
Excellent. Thank you for sitting quietly through this entire part.
Visit sciencesortof.com for show notes, links to all the stories we talked about, and ways to interact with the hosts, guests, and other listeners. Science Sort of is brought to you by the Brachiolobe Media Network of podcasts, with audio engineering by Tim Dobbs of the Encyclopedia Brunch podcast. That's all for this week. See you next time on Science Sort of.
It seems to me that like mutts ideally should be more like less susceptible to the sort of like the problems of being a pure breed, but who knows?
I think we've just really messed up dogs in the last 100 years, 150 years.
Yeah, that's probably you know what the problem is? The dogs don't have jobs.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I've thought about this. I've looked into this. If you look at like paintings of dogs, specific breeds from like the mid 1800s or even, you know, the late 1800s, like they're all kind of just dog shaped. Like they're not like the hyper expression of like these phenotypes that we've selected for. It's purely aesthetic because they're not working anymore. So it doesn't matter if a dachshund doesn't need to actually be able to kill a badger anymore.
Yeah,
if it did, it wouldn't look like a modern dachshund. Yeah, they just get increasingly dachshund, increasingly more themselves to the detriment of the breed. I don't know, man. I think we're breeding them for looks. We're not breeding them for brains. It's really interesting seeing like street dogs in when you go to like into Latin America, that they're a bunch of mutts, but it all sort of comes out in the wash after a while. Yeah. They've all got that sort of like rangy, like yellow dog look. Yep. Once it's a couple of generations in. Dingo-esque. Yeah, a bit. I mean, realistically.